It's the 1960s. The world is in flux, and it feels like the future is arriving faster than anyone imagined. Rockets are piercing the heavens, satellites orbit the Earth, and jetliners are stringing the globe. This is the era of boundless ambition, a time when anything seems possible. Europe was in the midst of rebuilding. Economic growth and modernization were taking hold, especially in the western part. France and Britain were emerging as major players. Meanwhile, the US and Soviet Union were locked in a fierce competition, from the arms race to the space race. This pushed nations to prioritize technological achievements as symbols of national prestige: the Apollo program, Sputnik, Obninsk, Calderhall. But while humanity was racing to the moon and nuclear energy promised to rewrite the rules of power, there was another frontier calling out: speed. Not the speed of a fighter jet or a spacecraft, but the speed of luxury, style and connectivity. Why spend 7 hours flying across the Atlantic when you could do it in 3? This wasn't just a dream, it was a challenge Europe was determined to meet. Both the US and Soviet Union were exploring supersonic passenger planes, but a new vision was born from the runways of France and Britain: Concorde, an aircraft unlike anything the world had seen, a supersonic car of ambition designed to conquer the skies and unite continents at twice the speed of sound. In the late 1950s, UK and France were already working on designs separately for a supersonic passenger plane. They were both ready to start prototyping, but the cost was so great that the British looked for international cooperation. France was on board. See, the British had the only engine in the world capable of doing the job, a two-spool turbojet named Olympus 593, initially developed for the iconic British war airplane, Avro Vulcan. The Anglo-French agreement to develop Concorde was signed on November 1962, bound both nations to share the costs, risks and reward of developing the aircraft. Two primary aerospace manufacturers formed the industrial backbone: Sud Aviation, based in France, and the British Aircraft Corporation in the UK. A number of subcontractors across the UK and France were awarded parts, and the main production lines were deployed in Bristol and Toulouse. Its development was funded entirely by the two governments. Engineers worked side by side to solve extremely hard problems, managing supersonic speeds, heat-resistant materials, aerodynamic efficiency. The vision was audacious. Here's the thing: Concorde cruised at twice the speed of sound and was developed for commercial airlines. This was a whole different ballgame than anything that had flown before. A sleek exterior and interior, powerful efficient engines, an aerodynamic design, a tiltable droop snoot, specially designed aluminum alloy to withstand extremely high temperatures, 13 separate fuel tanks, and materials expanding and contracting without being perceived by the crew or passengers. The main challenge of supersonic travel is that air behaves very differently above and below the sound barrier, and different kinds of aircraft work best in its case. This makes design difficult because it will inevitably spend time in both domains, cruising at supersonic speeds, but taking off, approaching, and landing at subsonic speeds. Designing a supersonic aircraft is pretty much like designing a car that can double as a boat. It's possible, but it's hard to make such a vehicle as cheap as a conventional car. Concorde really pushed the boundaries of what was technologically possible. It was finally showtime. Concorde first did a test flight in 1969, exceeding the speed of sound for the first time. It took several more years of refinement before Concorde entered commercial service. Flights from London and Paris to Bahrain and Rio de Janeiro started in 1976. Celebrities and royalty clamored to fly on it. Queen Elizabeth, Prince Charles and Diana, Elizabeth Taylor, Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger. London to New York in 3.5 hours at 60,000 feet. Concorde delivered. Europe could finally stand shoulder to shoulder with global superpowers in innovation and ambition. But speed couldn't outrun reality. Concorde was phenomenally expensive to develop and operate. It was a dream that came with a price tag. The project began with an estimated budget of £70 million, but delays, technical challenges, and inflation caused costs to balloon nearly 20 times. That would be close to £12 billion in today's money. The British and French governments absorbed the bulk of it. Only Air France and British Airways purchased, each receiving 6 aircrafts at discounted prices. Also, fuel costs were astronomical, especially amidst the oil shocks of the 70s. Its limited seatings with just 100 passengers made it very hard to turn a profit. Both airlines tried to make Concorde financially viable by targeting premium passengers, often charging them over $10,000 for a round-trip transatlantic journey in the 90s. But that wasn't enough to justify the overall investment. For comparison, a Boeing 747 guzzled 4 times less fuel and could carry nearly 500 passengers. Concorde also had to fight against the environmental lobby, which claimed the aircraft threatened the ozone layer by leaving a fog of sulfuric acid in its wake. Its sonic boom made traveling supersonically over land impossible without causing complaints from citizens. Many cities wouldn't allow the Concorde to fly because of how loud it was on takeoff. Eventually, supersonic flight over land in the United States was banned. And then came the tragedy. In July 2000, an Air France Concorde crashed shortly after takeoff at the Charles de Gaulle airport, killing 113 people. The accident was caused by debris on the runway, which punctured the tire. The resulting rubber fragments struck the wing and caused the fuel tank to rupture. A catastrophic fire started. The jet crashed into a nearby hotel 2 minutes after takeoff. All 9 crew and 100 passengers on board were killed, as well as 4 people in the hotel. Both airlines immediately grounded their Concorde fleets. This was the first time in Concorde's 24 years of commercial service that it faced such a crisis. It was a blow from which Concorde never fully recovered. Though it returned to service briefly after a number of safety improvements, demand fell, costs rose, and in 2003, Concorde flew its last passenger flight. This was also the time right after 9/11, which devastated the entire aviation industry. Since the late 1950s, there have been numerous plans to build a supersonic airliner. Most of them never got past the planning stage. Only 2 were ultimately built and entered commercial service, Tupolev 144 and Concorde. Tupolev 144 was the Soviet Union's response to Concorde. Even though the project was kicked off in 1963, it made its first flights in December 1968, a few months ahead of Concorde. According to reports, the Soviets borrowed many ideas from the Western aircraft, like its narrow delta wing. In the end, it had even less success commercially. It conducted only 55 passenger flights and was withdrawn in 1978. Today, there are no supersonic aircrafts in commercial service. Modern airliners fly at roughly the same speed as Boeing's first jet airliner, the 707. Concorde wasn't just an airplane. It was a bold leap into the future. Nothing remotely close to it had flown before, and nothing like it has flown since. Aside perhaps the Apollo program, Concorde was the most technically challenging project of the century. It was a flying declaration that Europe could compete with the US and the Soviet Union. A symbol of what Europeans can achieve when they dream big and build.